As they're heading out, this week in kind of this, what I'm calling our formation time of the service, we're going to pray through generosity prayer. And we've done this a couple times. But I'll answer the same questions and say some of the same things I said last time. Why a generosity prayer? So this is a practice of what I would call counter formation. And by that I mean the world we live in shapes us and how to think and live in many ways, and we're always being formed by something. And so in areas where the world is forming us to think and act in ways that aren't in line with the way of Jesus, I think we have to intentionally choose to push back. And so this prayer is asking God to meet us in one such area. Now, like I have said the last couple times, I don't want this prayer to make you nervous. This isn't heavy-handed compulsion on any individual. This is a prayer that I want us to pray to ask God collectively to shape us as a group of people. And this prayer is also about rejoicing in the fact that God has provided for us. And so it asks Him to shape our hearts accordingly. So I'm going to invite you to read it with me and pray this together with me. Holy Father, there is nothing we have that you have not given us. All we have and we are belong to you, bought with the blood of Jesus. To spend selfishly and to give without sacrifice is the way of the world. Generosity is the way of those who call Christ their Lord, who love him with free hearts and serve him with renewed minds, who withstand the delusion of riches that chokes the word, and whose hearts are in your kingdom and not in the world. Help us to increase in generosity until it can be said that there is no needy person among us. Help us to be trustworthy with such a little thing as money, that you may trust us with true riches. Above all, help us to be generous because you, Father, are generous. May we show what you are like to all the world. Amen. All right. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Bill Weigel. He's going to do a scripture reading for us. And I'll also say, if you're able to stand for the reading, please do, and then grab a seat after he has finished.
We're going to read from John chapter 5, verses 2 through 6, English Standard Version. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?"
Thank you, sir. Yep, grab a seat. All right, well, I'm back. If you were here last week, you know that my family, we were out of town. We took a trip to Disney World, and a few of you have asked, and so I'll answer to everyone at once. Yes, we had a wonderful time. It was everything that we hoped it would be. It was magical for our kids, but also I'm excited to be back. I'm sure I'll talk more about that trip at some point as I'm kind of thinking through a couple things. But I'm excited to be back, and here's why. Disney World is a wonderful place to visit. But in my opinion, it's not where you should want to live your life. And for many reasons, one of them being, in order to live your life there, you'd have to be fabulously rich. It is not an inexpensive place to go. But more so because it's not real life. And here's what I mean by that. It's fun, but it's not where the stuff of life happens. So I don't know how you guys operate. I really do try to enjoy those special moments when we have trips or holidays or things where it's like, man, this is a kind of a section out of normal life and a special moment. I think it's really good and right to enjoy and celebrate those things. But at the same time, I live for the day-to-day, because the reality is the way that we live our days is the way that we live our lives, ultimately. And so I say all that to say I'm excited to be back, because that was kind of like a little time out for us. But day-to-day life, that's where life is. And so in my case, I am blessed enough to get to do this. I mean, that is a gift. And so I wanted to say all that to say thank you for allowing us to step out and go away and honestly not even have to think about the service this past Sunday. I know it happened, and I know very little else, although there was a recording of the sermon, so I uploaded that and listened to it. And so I'm appreciative of that. And I want you to know that thank you for that, but also I'm excited for both where we are and where we're headed, both as a church plant and in the scriptures together. And so in the coming weeks, we're going to have some things that are pretty exciting, I think, rolling out. Starting next week, we're going to have an Advent series where we're going to kind of roughly follow the same stuff that they're going to be covering in kids ministry, which I think will be good. And we'll cap that off with a special Christmas Eve service, which will be Christmas Eve normal time, because Christmas Eve is a Sunday this year, if you hadn't noticed that yet. So that'll be normal time. And then after that, we'll take a couple weeks where we're going to do things really differently, a couple of unique Sunday mornings. I think they'll be great. We'll talk about those a little bit more as they get closer. And then in January, my hope is to dive into the who we are and where we're headed for Ridgeview Church, and really to invite all of you to jump in more fully and more fully understand what are we about and where are we going? What would it be like to be a part of this long term? So that said, today we're going to jump back in and finish out our mini-series here called Encounters with Jesus. A couple weeks ago, I got to share about Jesus' interaction with the religious leader Nicodemus. And there I talked about how Nicodemus, he was a good man. There's no doubt about that. And yet, in being good, he could not earn right standing with God. And that was a challenge for Nicodemus to understand. And then last week, Ron Webster stepped in for me, and he did a wonderful job of sharing about Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well, there's different ways to understand her story, but on some level, she was a very immoral person. And then the reality was there that while Jesus did not approve of her lifestyle, there were some things there, she was the first one to whom Jesus revealed that he was the Messiah, the Savior of the world. And I think there's something profound there in that's kind of how that played out. And so both Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, they were ultimately invited into life by Jesus himself. And for both of them, Jesus met them where they were and then lifted their eyes off of themselves to him. And so if you missed either of those, both of those messages are on our website, ridgeviewchurchwv.com, and so you could check those out if you'd like. But this morning we're going to look at an encounter between Jesus and a physically broken person from John 5. And so if you have a Bible with you, I would invite you to open up to John 5. I'm going to do that as well. And as always, if you need a Bible, we have some out by the door. You're more than welcome to grab one and take one. Or if you need a place to take notes, we have some of these journals out there. And those also have a little bit of who we are and what we're about on a little card right inside. So I'd invite you to grab those. But we're going to jump in here to John 5. We're going to start at the beginning and we'll work down through the first 15 or 18 verses. So here's how it starts. It says, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed." So Jesus, being a Jew, he went up to the Jewish feast at Jerusalem. And where does he go? Well, he doesn't go straight to the temple. He goes to a pool by the sheep gate, which, as I was kind of looking into it, in all likelihood, it was close to the temple. Might have even been on the way to the temple. But anyhow, he goes to this pool, the pool of Bethesda, and what does he see? Well, he finds a colony of blind, lame, and paralyzed people. And so think about it. In the ancient world, they lacked modern hygiene. They lacked modern medicine. And so this was an area with a lot of stinky, helpless, and possibly hopeless people. And so why were they there? What's with this colony of broken people? Well, there was a pool there called Bethesda. Now that word Bethesda in Hebrew, Beth is house. And then the Esda part would be translated either as mercy or kindness or kind of something in that vein. And so that place, the simple translation of that word would be, it's the house of mercy, at least theoretically. And so why are these broken people there? They were hoping for the mercy of God to be poured out, I think even metaphorically, from his house upon them. And their hopes were centered around that pool. And here's why. If you look in your text, in all likelihood, it probably skips verse 4. But verse 4, it was probably added later. It's probably right that it was skipped. But the verse 4 that you might have like down in a footnote or in your margin or something, it explains what's going on here. And so I'll pick up in verse 3 again and read what verse 4 could say. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. And then here's the skip part. Waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. Now, again, I think it's, as I looked into it a little bit, it's probably right that part was probably included later, but that's a commentary on why those people were gathered there. And so regardless of whether or not that's in the original text, it shows that there was a well-known popular hope that that particular pool was a place where God or angels would show up and would heal individuals, which, now this is getting kind of weird, I think, right? And so what in the world's going on here? Was there really a healing pool that an angel would visit? And the answer to that is we don't really know. Maybe, but I don't think that's what's going on here. Again, as I was kind of looking into this, in all likelihood, there was an intermittent spring underneath that pool that would occasionally spurt water into it and cause the water to be stirred up. And they thought that was the hand of an angel reaching down and kind of stirring the water. And so they believed that you know, if that's going on, well, if you're the first one in the pool, then you'll be healed. So here's what Josh Moody, in this book, John 1 through 12 for you, here's what he had to say about this pool. He says, imagine a world where there is no modern medicine. Imagine all the sick and the lame, the blind and the diseased. And imagine the hope that a particular place, a special pool, can provide healing. Perhaps it really was true that an angel would at times come and disturb the pool and bring healing. We do not know. We do know that invalids believed that this was true, and Jesus apparently seems to feel no need to correct this popular myth. So here's what's going on here. Jesus shows up in a place where broken people go, hoping for healing. And we don't know if something happened at some point that made it possible for that belief to exist. We don't really know where this belief came from. But the reality is this place, it probably was a place of hope for some. But over time, I bet the atmosphere became not that great. Because if we look specifically at the particular person we're about to look at, it hasn't worked out quite the way that he probably hoped. So if we jump back in to verse 5, it goes like this. It says, one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. Now, we don't know, there's a lot of things we don't know here. We don't know what's wrong with this man or how he ended up physically broken. We're going to take a guess at that here in a minute. We don't know how long he's been coming to the pool, but we do know in the next verse it says that he's been there a long time. We don't know if he's actually seen someone else get healed at the pool. Like, we don't know if that's why he keeps coming there. We don't even know his name. But what we do know about him is we know that his body's been broken for 38 years. And we know that in a day lacking modern medicine and hygiene, that's a lifetime. We don't know how old he was or when he became ill or broken, but we know that he was old by their standards and that this would have been a hopeless case. And we know that either this malady couldn't be fixed by medicine or that he didn't have the money to buy it, because certainly within 38 years that would have happened. And I think we can also take an educated guess and say whatever was going on, it wasn't going to fix itself. 38 years is a long time for it not to fix itself. So side note, many people think he was a paralytic. And the text itself doesn't say that, but it fits. And so I'm going to work off of that assumption that this man was a paralytic. And I think you'll see why that fits. The other thing we know is this. If there was hope in this place, it was not to be found in this man. This man was overlooked, he was forgotten, and he was broken, as we're about to see. So verse 6, read verses 6 and 7. It says, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, do you want to be healed? The sick man answered him, sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me. And so Jesus goes into this place with a whole bunch of broken people, and he approaches this man, and he asks him a strange and possibly insulting question. Do you want to be healed? Now, on the one hand, the answer is obvious. Yes. Why else is he there? He's at a place where broken people believe that they could be miraculously healed. So on the one hand, you'd say, well, of course he wants to be healed. On the other hand, check out his response in verse 7. He said, sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I'm going down, another steps before me. And so apparently this environment, this pool of Bethesda area, this is a pretty cutthroat environment. It's every man for himself. The water gets stirred up and it becomes a race. And if somebody's got to step over top of you to get in there, apparently they do. And apparently this man is there by himself. He has no friends or family. He says, I have no one. He's alone. And he also can't move quickly enough to win any race, which again, quite possibly he was paralyzed. But I wonder, he's been going there for a long time. Does he even try to get to the pool anymore when the water is stirred up? Or does he just watch with bitterness as others make a mad dash for the pool? You know, I think this man is not only broken physically, but I think he's broken relationally and emotionally and spiritually. And I think that this man, I think there's a good chance he was the meanest, nastiest man at the pool, just bitter. Just, man, I've been here for a long time. I've been broken like this for 38 years, and I'm at a place where there's supposed to be healing, and it's not coming for me. And Jesus walked up to him. Now think about it. Jesus passed numerous other broken people to go into this place. And he asks this man, do you want to be healed? Now I bet someone else heard Jesus ask him that question and tried to be like, oh Jesus, I want to be healed. Come over here, I want to be healed. But if that happened, John didn't write it down. So when Jesus, he went to the most hopeless, the most broken person at a place full of brokenness and hopelessness and asked him, do you want to be healed? It's as if Jesus is asking, do you even want that anymore? Or are you satisfied to sit here bitterly as the old broken guy? Are you even willing to receive healing? Now to me, his answer seems to suggest, I believe that I could be healed, but it's hopeless for me. It's not happening for me. But if you look in here, you read straight through it, I think this is kind of a strange twist. Jesus doesn't wait for him to give a full answer, a real answer. He kind of gives that excuse, and then you keep reading. In verse 8, Jesus said to him, get up, take up your bed, and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took his bed and walked. Now again, this is why a lot of people think this man was a paralytic. If you read in Mark 2, there's a healing of a paralytic, and Jesus uses those exact same words. Get up, take up your mat, and walk. But think about it. This man experienced 38 years of waiting for healing. And then 15 seconds with Jesus. And it's done. That's profound. But I actually think there's more going on here for this man, and there's certainly a whole lot more going on in John's gospel here, because there's two things that happen after this. One, there's a controversy that breaks out that's massively important in understanding Jesus. And then two, there's the lingering question about the newly healed man. His body in that moment was healed, but was his soul? So let's take these in order. Now, the end of verse 9 simply says, now that day was the Sabbath. And again, picking up from this book, Josh Moody calls this moment, what happens after this, he calls this a crossing of the Rubicon moment. And he says this, as Julius Caesar in ancient history decided when the moment came to cross the northern boundary of the area around Rome into which no army was allowed, so Jesus now crosses a boundary and is viewed as invading the territory belonging to God alone. And what happens after this, this is a moment of no return, because immediately a controversy breaks out. Okay, so let's look at verses 10 and 11. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, he's carrying around his mat, his bed. They say to him, it's the Sabbath, and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed. And he answered them, well, the man who healed me, that man told me, take up your bed and walk. Now, what's going on here? Well, see, the Jewish leaders, they had learned the lesson. If you go back, there's a Babylonian exile of the Jewish people. And they learned the lesson there really well, maybe too well in some ways. They were sent into exile for a variety of reasons. The people were worshiping idols. They weren't following God's law. They were also breaking Sabbath. That was a part of what was going on there. And so the Jewish leaders were saying, hey, we're not going to break Sabbath. And so they wanted to make sure that not even the slightest infraction was committed in case it led to a fresh exile. And so they became kind of Sabbath police. And so rules that were intended to guard against working on the Sabbath, that were supposed to be a gift to the people, and to proclaim a higher meaning of the Sabbath as a rest in God, those became oppressive burdens that prevented somebody from being healed on the Sabbath. So this is kind of bizarre, but then the man is like, well, yeah, but the guy who healed me, he told me to do this. It's almost as if he's saying, well, I know this is the rule, but you guys didn't heal me the last 38 years, and he showed up, and bam, I'm healed. I'm going to listen to him. Okay, and you kind of see that continue. Verses 12 and 13, they're saying, well, who told you this is okay? And the newly healed man says, I don't know. I don't know his name. I don't know where he went. I don't know him. But he healed me. Well, the story isn't over. Jesus shows back up, and then the showdown on both fronts continues, both the man and his heart and Jesus and the Jewish leaders. So verse 14 says this. Afterward, we don't know how much later, but a little time later, Jesus found the man in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Now, there's a lot going on here, okay? So first off, we know that Jesus decouples the idea. He separates the idea of that physical brokenness comes from sin. We actually see that in John, just a few chapters later, John 9. And so Jesus says, no one sinned that caused you to be broken. That's not why there's disabilities and physical brokenness and special needs and things like that. It's not because of a person's sin that happens. It is because there's sin in the world, but it's not because of sin necessarily. So an individual's sin is not always involved when there's sickness. And yet here, if you look at that verse 14, Jesus seems to indicate that for this man, there is a connection between sin and his body's brokenness. Now again, just because there's a connection here doesn't mean there always is. And the connection, what it was, is unclear. But here's what is clear. Jesus had healed him of suffering and pain that had somehow been connected to sin. And now Jesus shows up, and what's he do? He warns him to stop sinning so that something worse doesn't happen. So what's going on here? Well, Frederick Bruner, in his commentary, here's how he explains it. I thought this was helpful. He says, this is Jesus offering this former invalid both grace and truth. And so the grace is the first part of that verse. Look, you've been made well. And it's almost like, look, never forget this moment. I showed up. You had been broken for 38 years. This is the most important moment in your life. Live in gratitude of that. You need to always be looking back on that. And that's grace, and that's the whole point. The healing was a free gift. He didn't even explicitly say, yes, Jesus, I want to be healed. But Jesus did it. The man did nothing to earn that grace, right? That's the whole point. But it came. And so I think the invitation there is live in light of that grace. But then the truth that Jesus offers this man is, now stop sinning so that something worse doesn't happen to you. Now, again, it's important to get the order right. It's the grace before the truth. It's live out of that grace in the truth of holiness, that holiness follows grace, that it's a natural response of God's grace. The fact that this man had earlier blamed other people, though, when Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? What's he say? Oh, but Jesus, I don't have anyone. No one's here to help me. No one cares about me. That could suggest that the man's sin may be an ingrained blaming of other people for his problems and never himself. We don't know that for sure, but it may be that he has a victim mentality. Regardless, it seems to me that this is the way that Jesus invites this particular man to faith. Again, he's offering him grace, and then he's inviting him to live in light of that grace. Remember, faith is responding to God's grace with trust. And so the question for that man is, at this moment, your body has been healed. How about your soul? What do we want to do with that? And the invitation, I think, at this moment that Jesus is offering him is, Jesus is saying, trust in me and receive eternal life. Now, some of that is unstated, but I think that's what's going on here. Regardless, the story ends in a kind of fascinating way. I'll read verses 15 through 17. It says, the man went away, and he told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. Now, 2 comments here. One, either this man was malicious in going and telling the Jews that, or he was ignorant. Because he goes, Jesus heals him, they say, who healed you? Why are you carrying your bed? What's going on here? And he's like, I don't know who it was. Then Jesus shows up, invites him into life. And what's he do? He runs off to the Jews and says, hey, I know who it was that healed me. It was Jesus. It's his fault that I'm carrying my bed around on the Sabbath. Now, either he's malicious, either that's a negative thing that he's doing, or he's just kind of dumb to the situation that's going on here. Regardless, we don't know of what's going on here, but I think it's fascinating. I think it's worth chewing on. But 2, this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, it says, because Jesus was saying things like, he was healing people on the Sabbath, and then to make it okay, he was saying, my Father is working until now, and I'm working. Now, let me briefly explain that as I understand it, and then I'll bring us to a close. When Jesus appears to break the Sabbath rules, what's he do? Well, he explains that he is, in fact, in charge of everything, including the Sabbath, making himself equal to God. And so that's why Moody said in this book, this is a point of no return. This is invading territory belonging to God alone. Now, there's a little bit of a backstory here that he brings up that I think is helpful. It's, in rabbinic Judaism, and Judaism at their time, there was a discussion that had developed regarding whether or not it could be said that God stopped working entirely on the Sabbath. So if you open to the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 2:3 says that God rested on the 7th day. And the question is, what sort of rest is that? Because surely they're arguing, well, if God completely stopped for 1 day out of 7, then the universe would cease to exist for 1 day out of 7. And that didn't happen. So their conclusion was that while God rested from the act of creation on the Sabbath, it wasn't a complete ceasing of activity, but it was rather a symbolic rest that indicated that's a special day. And so then their thinking was, therefore it's okay to say God's always working. It seems that Jesus picks up on all of that, knows that whole conversation is going on, and says, God's always working. By the way, I'm always working. Why? Because Jesus is saying, because I'm God. Now, that's where we get things, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but that's where we get things like C.S. Lewis's trilemma, where he says Jesus is either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's the Lord of the universe. And you start seeing that. You keep reading through John, you start seeing people be like, you're demon-possessed, or you're crazy. And then there's other people who are like, yeah, but he healed this guy who had been an invalid for 38 years. Or you see people saying, yeah, but he just healed a guy who was born blind and now he can see. Can a demon do that? Can a crazy person do that? And there's this controversy that breaks out. Regardless, the Pharisees and the religious leaders took offense at that idea that Jesus is the Lord of the universe. And I think that can present us with the question as well. Do you take offense at that? Now let me offer you two ways to respond. I'll talk through these, and then I'll give you a moment to actually consider how you might respond. One, let's go back to Jesus' question to the invalid of 38 years. He asked him, do you want to get well? And again, I think that's a strange question. I mean, why else would an invalid be there unless he wanted to be healed? But I think it gives us a window into a couple of important things. I mean, the healing part, that's no problem for Jesus. He could do it then, he could do it now. There's no question on that. Now, does he do it for everyone? Does he do the miraculous healing thing for everyone? No. I mean, even in this story, it said there were a multitude of blind, lame, and paralyzed people there. It doesn't say that Jesus healed them all on his way out. It says he went in and he healed the one. It doesn't say anything about any of the others. He doesn't do that. But he can. But I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the broken man. I mean, his faith was in the magical almost properties of that pool. And I think those are misplaced hopes. And so I'll ask you, do you have misplaced hopes? You know, what is it that you truly believe that you need to be healed from? You know, what is it that you think, oh, if I could just be healed from that, from this thing. Maybe it's a physical illness or ailment, or maybe it's a relational thing. Maybe it's something else in life. You got something, you're like, man, if that could just be taken care of, then it would all be good. And how's that going to happen? And more to the point, is that even what your true need is? I think we get so hung up on those things and think, oh, things would be all better if that was healed, but would they? I mean, again, let's be clear, Jesus can heal. And I really do believe that we are invited to ask Jesus to do so, even in our day. And that we're also invited to hold those things open-handed before God. Believing he can do it, having faith that he can do it, but holding it open-handed, knowing that he will decide whether or not he does. But that's besides the point. I think the bigger point is this. Would things really be better if whatever it is you might have in your mind, if that was taken care of, if it was healed, would that really fix things? Because maybe it's like this man, and yeah, he had a physical brokenness that he'd experienced for 38 years. But maybe he had a deeper spiritual need there. And so I think regardless, we need to ask two questions. Is whatever it is that I constantly deal with, if you have that kind of thing, is that really your biggest need? It might be. But with this invalid, his most obvious need was his illness. But his greatest need was his sinful heart. And so I just ask, put yourself in his shoes. Do you want to get well? Do you want to be healed? Ask yourself, do I even want to be healed, or would I rather wallow in my pain and collect pity? Because sometimes I think healing is instantaneous and painless like it was here, but sometimes, a lot of times, it's slow. It's painful. And moving beyond something that's held you under itself for a long time, man, that might be moving out of something. It might mean letting go of something. I mean, notice this man, Jesus even told this man, pick up your mat and get out of here. He tells him, leave behind the pool of Bethesda. You don't belong here anymore. It might mean something like that for us as well, that we have to leave something behind. And maybe, just maybe, you're like the broken man in that he spent a long time right by the thing he believed could heal him, but he never partook in it. Now, whether or not the pool could heal him, that's a little secondary here to what I'm saying. You know, maybe you've spent a long time in and around the things of Jesus, but you've never actually stepped into it yourself. Maybe you've never been willing to admit your own culpability in your brokenness. And maybe you need to say to God today, hey, I am physically broken because I'm a sinner. I'm spiritually broken because I'm a sinner. Maybe you need to ask God to free you from your sin, or even you're like, I did that a long time ago. Maybe you need to ask him to free free you from your sinful patterns. And you need to leave that brokenness behind. And if that's you, then please reach out. Because there's probably some things that you'll need to work through. So again, do you want to get well? The other way I would invite you to respond would be to observe, you see what Jesus did, and follow in Christ's footsteps in moving toward the broken. Matthew Henry said this about John 5. Observe, when Christ came up to Jerusalem, he visited not the palaces, but the hospitals. And let me just point out, I know where we live. You know, I know that if you're here, you probably live in or around the city of Bridgeport. And this is a community that does a really good job of hiding and minimizing brokenness. And in some ways, I think that makes it easy for us to live as if there isn't brokenness around us. And I think we as a community do a good job of hiding physical brokenness that's not on full display in our town. But I also think we learn to paper over our other forms of brokenness. But I've also lived here long enough to know that there's brokenness everywhere in our midst. And if we're willing, and we'll see it if we're willing to notice it and move toward it. And so my question here is, where is your pool of Bethesda? You know, where do you go to be among the hurting and the broken and to join God in the work he's already doing? Where do you go where you're surrounded by hurting people and where you can cry out to God and say, God, I'm here and I see the brokenness. Show me the one person you're inviting me to move toward. You know, it's not your job to fix anyone. But God does do most of his work through people. And so I think that means we should be asking ourselves, where is my pool of Bethesda? And when am I going there? And how often? And who is it that I'm moving toward? And am I praying for them? And am I keeping up with them or following up with them? You know, Jesus is the light of the world. He's the light in the darkness, and his Spirit is in you. And so every time we leave these doors, or every time we leave the doors to our homes and go out into a hurting world, there's an opportunity to push back darkness with the light of Christ. And so again, where's your pool of Bethesda? You know, are you going there? What's the brokenness that you see? And after you see it, are you praying for the lost and broken people of that place? And are you willing to engage them for the sake of Christ? I'm going to give you a moment to respond. And on the one hand, I'll ask you, if you're the person who would say, I need that healing, then by all means, I would invite you to come and let's pray together, to come and let's meet together, whatever we need to do. But even in this moment, I'd invite you to cry out to God and say, God, I need healing in this area of my life. Maybe it's physical, maybe it's emotional, maybe it's spiritual. But God, I need healing. And again, if you need to come forward, if you need to reach out after the service, we would invite that. But I'm going to give you a moment to deal with that. Where is it? Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be well? I'll give you 20 seconds on that one, and I'll come back for the other one. God, meet us in our brokenness. May we be willing to admit our need, that we need you, whether we have never decided to follow you and trust you, or whether we decided that decades ago and yet we still feel brokenness because we still live in a world of sin and we still engage with sin even in our own lives. The second thing I wanted to ask you and invite you to consider is, where is your pool of Bethesda? Where is it that God might be inviting you to step in, where there's brokenness, where there's need, and where it's not your job to fix anybody, but to ask God, show me the need, show me the brokenness, and show me how I can move toward that brokenness, and show me what role I might play in that. I'm going to give you a minute to pray on that, to consider that. Again, if your heart is stirring on either of those fronts, I would love to meet with you immediately after service or later this week or whatever. Please reach out. But I'm going to pray and invite the worship team to come back up as I do that. Dear Jesus, I praise you that you move toward brokenness. That Jesus, you can in an instant heal any wrong, any hurt, any brokenness. But that you care much more about spiritual brokenness, that you care about what's in us. And so, Lord, I pray that you would give us eyes to see that brokenness, both in ourselves and in the world around us. Show us, reveal to us where we are broken and where we need you, and yet refuse to give ourselves over to you. And also show us the brokenness in the world around us, and equip us and empower us to move toward that.